Welcome to the second segment of the lectures on autonomy and privacy. In this segment, I'm going to talk about further about this notion of moral autonomy, and I'm going to talk about the conditions under which moral autonomy fails or is undermined, and how these can be excusing conditions from moral agency and maybe excusing conditions from moral accountability. So what is autonomy? Well, there's two types, and we're going to talk about them both in the series of lectures. In this segment, though, I'm going to talk mostly about moral autonomy, which is the capacity to govern oneself according to one's ethical reasoning. It's to apply to oneself, auto, the moral law, nomos, from the Greek. Personal autonomy is the capacity to make authentic decisions about one's own life, to choose your conception of the good, and to endorse one's commitments. And this is an important thing too, and we'll talk about that a little in the next segment. Moral autonomy can be undermined. There are different threats to moral autonomy, and these are potentially excusing conditions. They potentially excuse people from moral accountability. For example, the big one is coercion. If you're coerced into doing something, if you're forced to do it either physically or by threat of great nastiness to happen, then you're perhaps not morally accountable for what you did. And these sorts of conditions are important when we're trying to assign praise and blame. So the threat of coercion, a coercive threat, is a morally unjustified declaration of the intent to cause harm. For example, if the supervisor says to the employee, mow my lawn at home or I'll fire you at work, this is not a justified use of the supervisor's authority. So that would be coercive. If the policeman says to the criminal, stop or I'll shoot, that's also a declaration of the intent to cause harm, but it's probably legitimate. That's the policeman's role, is to stop criminals. And a coercive threat interferes with authentic decision making, and if the threat is strong enough, it can be an interference with autonomy and moral accountability. Lying and deception can interfere with autonomy. Lies are linguistic communications and deceptions are non-linguistic communications, but they both have the intent of trying to get someone to believe something that's false. And a fraud is when you obtain a benefit by doing this. So both of these things can interfere with people's autonomy and hence with whether or not we should hold them morally accountable. So can the unjustified, and again there's a moral element to all of this, the unjustified non-disclosure of information with intent to manipulate, that can interfere with people's autonomy and with their decision making and with their accountability. Sometimes people are perhaps justified in not disclosing things. That's when they have a right to privacy. Okay, so if you have a right to privacy, you're justified in not disclosing information. But sometimes you should disclose information, as is often the case in sales tactics. A certain amount of question of how much information should be disclosed by salespeople to customers. Conflicts of interest, I think, also are threats to moral autonomy. This arises because, like everything else we do, information management involves specialization and the division of labor. We're no longer all smart enough to know everything. Perhaps once upon a time you could be responsible for knowing everything there was to know about everything you did, but not anymore. Now you have to depend on expert, authoritative opinion. We accept the information of others, or other people accept information from us on our authority. Now the key thing is here, to rely on the authority of someone else, you have to be able to evaluate their reliability. And conflicts of interest can affect reliability. Even if you avoid the conflict, even if you are in a conflict of interest situation, but you're able to overcome it and still put the interests, say, of your customer first and your own second, there is still it's still a conflict of interest situation, because the your reliability is in question, and the customer is not able to evaluate your reliability if they do not know that that your interests are in conflict with theirs. Okay, so, and it's not so much that you say you're in conflict of interest with somebody and you give them bad advice to help yourself. It's that they are not able to evaluate your reliability if they do not know about that conflict of interest. So you should either avoid or conflict of interest situations, or reveal the conflict of interest so that people can judge your reliability and make an autonomous decision. Lack of competence can, of course, interfere with autonomy. If you have emotional disorders, cognitive impairments, you're a child, you're unable to make these sorts of decisions. If you have never been educated properly in ethical decision making, then perhaps you are. This may excuse you from accountability in certain circumstances. Again, it's always a question of degree. Is the lack of competence enough, or is it willful blindness, or is there some other reason? But is it enough to underlie a judgment that you're excused because of lack of competence? We've talked about these before. Oppressive conceptual frameworks, which are strongly held, very resilient sets of beliefs about the world and human nature and values, and they make subordination seem normal, natural, and unquestionable. If you are inside one of those and you unquestioningly do what's expected of you, it makes it very, very difficult to consider certain options. And this may also, under certain circumstances, if the framework is sufficiently strong, may excuse you from moral accountability and make you morally non-autonomous or heteronomous. Emotional manipulation can do this as well. Emotions have cognitive consequences. They focus attention on the stimulus. They make it difficult to attend to other aspects. By focusing attention on one thing, they make it difficult to attend to other things. So hence the saying, love is blind. Fall in love, and you're unable to see the faults of your love interest. Emotions can change, but it's slow. Because you can't see the problems with your love interest, it's very, very hard for you to find out that your love interest is not the person you think that the person is. So hence the saying, marry in haste and repent at leisure. It takes time to get over what you can't see. And this sorts of emotional manipulation can go on in maybe in advertising, but again, it's a question of degree. When are you excused because you are being emotionally manipulated, or when are you just being persuaded in a legitimate way that uses emotional techniques? It's a matter of degree. These are sort of judgments that you have to make when you're thinking about moral accountability. So this takes us back to this flowchart that we looked at before. Remember, we have an agent has a wrongful decision of some sort, let's say, and we worried whether was the agent causally responsible for what was going on, and if yes, then the agent could be held accountable in a sort of retributive or punitive sense. But perhaps not. Maybe they're not causally responsible. We can still think about their motivation, and we can still think about their character, and we can think about their virtues and vices, and we can think about their motivations. Okay, and these are all different ways that they can be morally accountable. But before you get into that, there is this whole question of whether they acted freely and whether they were autonomous when they were they morally autonomous in making their decision? And perhaps not. If any of those excusing conditions that I talked about amounted to enough to excuse them, right? Their potential excusing conditions, those threats to autonomy amounted to enough to excuse them, then that's another reason for saying that perhaps somebody is not morally accountable for what happened. Perhaps they were deceived, perhaps they were coerced, perhaps they were emotionally manipulated, etc., etc. But again, there's a judgment call here. You don't, just because there is some coercion present, you still have to make the judgment of whether the coercion is strong enough to excuse them from moral accountability. All right, take a moment and look at this question. Which is the best example of deception? Okay, deception is a non-linguistic way of fooling people, of getting them to believe something that is false, that you want them to do, and manipulating their behavior. So let's have a look here. Supervisor promises a large promotion to the financially strapped employee if the employee goes on a date with him. Well, there's no real deception here. There's certainly something wrongful going on. There's an abuse of power here. There's what's sometimes called a coercive offer, perhaps, if the employee is financially strapped enough. But this is not deception. I think everybody knows what's going on here. The salesperson wins the sale by distracting the customer's attention from the manufacturing defect. Now here we probably have a case of deception. There's something non-linguistic going on, which is the distraction of attention, and it is manipulating the customer, getting the customer to do something that the customer might not otherwise do. So that's a possible answer, good possibility. This is also an example of a violation of moral autonomy, because we talked about this before. The mafia use threats to make something happen, but it's not deception. Again, everybody knows what's going on. It is an interference with moral autonomy, and maybe one that will excuse the owner from what the owner does, but it's not deception. And D is, of course, about privacy. So our best answer again here is B. So the point of this lecture was to get you to think about the possible excusing conditions that are threats to people's autonomy, to their ability to be moral agents. And if these potential excusing conditions are strong enough, then they will excuse somebody from moral accountability.